In this video, we'll be looking at what is called activity-based costing. Now, activity-based costing is just another method of absorbing your overheads. But instead of using overhead absorption rates, we use what are called cost driver rates. Now, they are still worked out using budgeted information, and to work out a cost driver rate we need the budgeted cost pool, and we divide that by the budgeted cost driver. So we're still using budgeted figures. A cost pool is a collection of overheads that are all caused by the same activity. So we add together all the overheads that are caused by the same activity, and that's our cost pool. The activity that caused those overheads is the cost driver. Okay, so we've got a cost pool, which is a collection of overheads, and we've got a cost driver, which is the activity that caused those overheads. That activity could be machine hours, the same as we've seen in overhead absorption rates. It could be number of production runs. It could be number of orders. So one of the big differences between overhead absorption costing and activity-based costing is that activity-based costing is a lot more accurate because it looks at the overheads individually and identifies what caused those overheads and then uses that as a basis for the absorption. Whereas with absorption costing, we just get all of the overheads for a cost centre and we divide it by either machine hours or labour hours. So we've got basically two types of activity. But with ABC costing or activity-based costing, we can have several different cost driver rates because we've identified several different activities that have caused the overheads. So you'll see in your workbook there are a number of steps that we need to go through. We firstly need to know what the overhead costs are for the business. We need to know what caused those overheads to be incurred. We then need to group together all the overheads that are caused by the same activity. We can then use those figures to work out our cost driver rates, which are very much the same as overhead absorption rates, and then we can use those cost driver rates to work out the overhead absorbed. So if we look at an example, so this is on page 106. So you may recognise these figures from earlier examples. So we're using the same figures as we've used before, but this time we're applying activity-based costing, and you will often just see it referred to as ABC costing. So we've got all our overheads. So step one was to identify the overhead costs for the business. So that's these. Step two is to identify the major activities that take place in the business that causes the overhead costs. And that's been done for you here. So the accountant has identified the following drivers. So remember, the drivers are the activities that causes the costs. So the accountant is saying that the machine power cost is caused because of the number of machine hours that are worked. Factory heat and light is caused by machine hours. Machine setup costs, they're £23,000. The reason for that is because of the number of setups or number of batches. Customer invoicing costs, they were £3,000 because of the number of orders that were processed. Material handling costs were £2,000 because of the number of times that the material had to be moved. And the dispatch costs were £9,000 because of the number of orders that were dispatched. So that's step 2. Step 3 is to group all the overhead costs that are caused by the same activity together into the cost pools. Okay, so step 3. Machine power was caused by machine hours. And factory heat and light was also caused by machine hours. So machine power was £4,000, factory heat and light £2,000. So we've grouped those together. So that's one of our cost pools. Machine setup costs was caused by the number of setups, so in other words the number of batches. If we have a look at the other overheads, there weren't any others that were caused by that same activity. So machine setup costs £23,000. There's no other costs caused by the same activity, so that's in a cost pool on its own. Customer invoicing costs was caused by number of orders. And if you have a look at the other overheads, we can see that dispatch costs were also caused by the number of orders. So we can pool those two together. So invoicing costs and dispatch costs. So invoicing was 3,000. Dispatch was 9,000. So there's a third cost pool, £12,000. So that just leaves material handling costs of £2,000, which is in a cost pool on its own. So there's step 3. We have our cost pools. So step 4 is to determine the cost driver rate, right, using the cost drivers and the overheads for each of the cost pools. So our first cost pool is this £6,000, machine power, factory heat and light. The driver was machine hours. So we need to know what the machine hours were, so that we can then divide the cost pool by the cost driver. So if we look at the information that we're given in this table here, looking for machine hours, we've got machine hours per unit, 6 and 5. Now you need to be very careful with this. You've got to make sure that you get your time periods the same. Right. And by that I mean that the overheads we've been given, they're expected to be incurred in the next accounting period. Right, remember we're using budgeted figures, so that's correct. This is what we expect or we budget, but that's in the accounting period. So if the overhead relates to the accounting period, we need to know what the machine hours are going to be for the accounting period. So we're not using the machine hours for one unit, we need to know what the machine hours are going to be in the whole period. So looking back at the table, the other useful piece of information is that we expect to produce in the period 2,000 units of XR12 and 2,600. So we can work out what the machine hours are going to be for the period. So 2,000 units times 6, so that's plus 2,600 times 5, and that gives us 20, it's not pound, gives us 25,000 hours. So now we can work out our cost driver rate. So it's our cost pool of £6,000 divided by the driver, which we know is machine hours, which were 25,000, gives us 0.24 per machine hour. So very much like an overhead absorption rate that we've already been calculating. So remember, this is step 4 we're doing, so if I just squeeze that in up here, step 4. So that's one cost driver. So now let's look at our next cost pool. So our cost pool, £23,000. This is our machine setups. The driver for machine setups is the number of setups or number of batches. Remember again, this needs to be for the period. So if we look back in our table, we haven't got the number of batches or number of setups. The only bit of information we have is the batch size. So we know that each batch is produced in a size of 100 for the XR12 and 50 for the XY14. So we can use that to work out the number of batches. If we're expecting to produce 2,000 XR2s and they're in batch sizes of 100, then 2,000 divided by 100 will give us the number of batches. So we got 20 of the XR12 and 2,600 divided by 50 gives us 52 of the XY14. So the total number of batches, 72. So now we can work out our cost driver rate, which is our cost pool, £23,000, divided by our cost driver, 72, gives us 319.44 per batch. Okay. Right. Third cost pool, £12,000, which was the invoicing and dispatch costs. Invoicing, driver, number of orders, dispatch cost, the driver is number of orders. So we need the number of orders. Okay, nice straightforward one. This one's been given to us. Orders per period, 600 and 400. So the driver, number of orders, 600 plus 400. So that's 1,000. So our cost driver rate is our cost pool, £12,000 divided by 1,000 orders gives us £12 per order. And the last one, material handling, got a cost pool of £2,000. So what was the driver? Why did we have £2,000 of material handling costs? It was because of the number of material movements. So our driver is number of movements. So we need to work out the number of movements. Remember, again, it is for the period. So we are told 9 movements on the XR12, 5 on the XY14, but that is per batch. So we need to know how many batches there were in the period to get the movements for the period. Now we've already worked that out because we needed to know the number of batches for the material setup driver. So here we have 20 batches of the XR12, 52 batches of the XY14. Okay, so XR12, XY14. So we had 20 batches and we had 52 batches. So if we just go back, we had material movements per batch, 9 and 5. So we've got 20 times 9, 52 times 5, it's 260. So our total number of movements, 440. So the cost driver rate, £2,000 divided by 440 gives us £4.55 per movement. So there we have it. We have 4 cost driver rates. Okay. So for every machine hour worked, we've got 24 pence in overheads. For every batch, £319.44 in overheads. For every order, £12 in overheads. And for every movement, we incur £4.55 in overheads. So whereas with the overhead absorption costing you've been looking at so far, you may have only had 1 or perhaps 2 overhead absorption rates based on labour hours or machine hours. We've now got 4 overhead absorption rates, and they're all based on different activities: movements, orders, batches and machine hours. So we're almost complete. We've worked out our overhead absorption rates, or our cost driver rates. What we now need to do is work out what our overhead absorbed will be using these rates. Okay. Now again, need to be careful because we've got various different rates. we've got 24p per machine hour, but then we've got an amount per batch and an amount per order. The easiest way to work out your overheads absorbed is to do it firstly for your total production and then divide it down to get your overhead absorbed for 1 unit. So we're asked to work out the overhead to be absorbed by each unit of XR12. So as I said, I'm firstly going to do it for 2000 units and then divide it down. So the overhead absorbed for the XR12. Our first cost driver rate, right, is 0.24 per machine hour. So remember, I'm doing it for 2000 units initially. So we've got 0.24 per machine hour, and we need to know what the machine hours were for 2000 XR12s. So back to our table, 2000 XR12, each of them takes 6 machine hours. So it's 2000 times 6. That works out to £2,880. Okay, so 2000 times 6, 12,000 machine hours, 24p a machine hour. Our second cost driver rate, £319.44 per batch. So this is per batch, 319.44. So we need to know how many batches there were for the XR12. If you recall, we've worked this out. XR12, number of batches, 20. So 319.44 times 20. So that's the second overhead figure. So then our third cost driver rate, £12 per order. So per order, it's £12. How many orders were placed in the period for the XR12? 600 orders. So that's £7,200. And our last overhead or absorption rate or cost driver rate, £4.55 per movement. Okay, so per movement, £4.55. And how many movements in the period for the XR12? Well, there was 9 movements per batch, and during the period there was 20 batches. We've already know that. We worked it out earlier and we've used it in these calculations. So we know there's 20 batches. So it's 9 movements times 20 batches. So £4.55 times 180. So that gives us £819. So that's our overheads absorbed. Adding it all up, £17,288. That's for the 2,000 units. We're asked to do it for 1 unit. So if we now divide that by 2,000, so we've got the overhead absorbed per unit is 17288 divided by 2,000, £8.64. So it is costing us £8.64 in overheads to produce one XR12. Now this may seem quite complicated, but it's actually very similar to what you have already been doing. We're looking at budgeted overheads, we're looking at budgeted activity, we're dividing the overheads by the activity, but we're just making it a bit more refined. We're grouping our overheads into cost pools, and what each of the overheads in the cost pool have in common is that they were all caused by the same activity. That activity is referred to as a driver. So once we have our cost pools and we have our drivers, divide the one by the other, we have our overhead absorption rate or our cost driver rate, and then use that exactly as we did before, multiply the overhead absorption rate or the cost driver rate by the actual activity. So what is it we actually expect to do? Because the rates tend to be on different basis, so machine hours, batches and so on, as I said, it's often a lot easier to then work out what your overheads absorbed are in total and then divide it down if you need the overhead absorbed per unit. Now I know this is a little bit of a complicated area. We have got, I believe, a couple of weeks allocated to going through this. So what I would like you to do for the moment is now refer back to your workbook. This is example 4.6 that I've worked through. Either go through the video again or now go through it in the workbook. You will see that they have also calculated the overheads per unit for the second product, XY14. So follow that through, make sure that you understand how it's being worked out. Then if you have time, have a look at the example that follows on page 109, because that's what we're going to be starting with in the next session. Okay, so see how you get on and we'll discuss it in the next seminar.